I just wish I liked this book a lot more than I did. What's up, guys? My name is Moo. I am a college student who loves reading, and I'm here to share that love with all of you. So, I have a backlog of unread books. I'm sure I've stated it before. I wish I didn't have to state it again, but as of now, as of when I am editing this video, this is how many unread books I have. As you can see, it is obviously a problem. I'm sure it's a problem that many of us have. Buying books and reading books are two very different hobbies. I am trying my best to stop buying books, but it seems like the second I stopped trying to buy books, books just started falling into my lap. If you think that I'm gonna pass up a Sally Rooney book in a little free library, you're crazy. So that being said, I get gifted a lot of books. I find books for free and they end up being books that are on my list, which that wish list of unowned books is probably over 500 books long. But I'm trying my best to read through the books that I have before buying new books. And from here on out, I'm going to try using the library a lot more than buying actual books, and then buying the books that I like and not buying the books that I don't. So that explanation was all to say I have a lot of unread books, and I have plenty that are a couple years old. I have plenty of picks that I added to my list when I really didn't know what I like yet. I didn't have an established taste in books yet. Now I'm more picky. Now I know exactly what I want in a book, so I really only add to my want to read list books that fit that category specifically. However, I don't want to waste the books that I bought, so I'm trying to get through the ones that I have gotten years ago and slowly making my way back to zero. This book falls into the category of not knowing what I liked yet. And I think from reading the summary, anyone who watches my channel enough may be able to know why. So let's start with the summary. If you knew the date of your death, how would you live your life? It's 1969 in New York City's Lower East Side, and word is spread of the arrival of a mystical woman, a traveling psychic who claims to be able to tell anyone the day they will die. The Gold Children, 4 adolescents on the cusp of self-awareness, sneak out to hear their fortunes. The prophecies inform their next 5 decades. Golden boy Simon escapes to the West Coast, searching for love in 80s San Francisco. Dreamy Clara becomes a Las Vegas magician, obsessed with blurring reality and fantasy. Eldest son Daniel struggles to maintain security as an army doctor post 9/11, and bookish Varya throws herself into longevity research, where she tests the boundary between science and immortality. Both a dazzling family love story and a sweeping novel of remarkable ambition and depth, The Immortalists probes the line between destiny and choice, reality and illusion, in this world and the next. It is a deeply moving restatement to the power of story, the nature of belief, and the unrelenting pull of familial bonds. So, the summary is quite interesting and quite compelling. However, it is not something that I would go out of my way to read. If you have been following this channel and have watched enough videos, I think you would be able to know that I don't really like books that are set in New York or San Francisco or LA or Chicago or any other urban city. I especially wouldn't really like a book set in Seattle that much because that's where I live, and I just think that that would be a really weird experience for me personally. But I know plenty of people live in New York and LA and consume media about New York and LA, so maybe I'm just being crazy. But that should have been my first indication that I knew I probably wouldn't like this book. However, I do think there are things about the book that I think did not make it as strong as it could have been. Because actually, when I was reading it, I was pretty compelled for the first half of the book, and then the other half of the book happened and it just kind of dwindled down for me, and I was just kind of bored with it. So let's get into the book, and I will tell you what I liked about it, because there were plenty of things I liked about it, and tell you what I didn't like it and why I ended up deciding that this book wasn't for me, and I just believed it could be so much better than it is. So, as the summary says, this book starts with 4 siblings. Their ages range from 7 to 13 when the book starts, and it goes from 1969 all the way to 2010. However, the prologue starts with the children going to this mystical woman, and we only hear Varya's outcome. We don't hear the outcomes of any of the other children. However, this changes their dynamic forever, and what used to be a close sibling bond between the 4 of them sort of dissipated and was no longer as strong as it once was. So that's the prologue, and then we go from youngest sibling to oldest sibling, and unfortunately it is also the order in which each person passes. So first we start with Simon. Now, Simon, as I said, traveled to the West Coast in the 80s to San Francisco to find love. The second I heard that Simon was gay, I think anyone would be able to put the pieces together of what happened to him. It's really a shame, because Simon's story was the most interesting to me. So it was really sad that he was the one that ended up passing first. It was a story of a 20-year-old contracting AIDS and passing away. It was just so sad because he wanted to find himself. He wanted to find his identity. He became a ballet dancer and had this vibrant community and vibrant life, but he was reckless and he was quite selfish, which makes sense because he passed away when he was 20. He moved to San Francisco when he was 16. Of course, he's going to keep his own interests in mind because he's a child. I mean, like, I'm 21. Do you think that I think about anyone else more than I think about myself on a given basis? Don't get me wrong, I want to be a selfless person. I want to be thinking of others at all times, and I don't want to ever put my needs above others. But like, people in their teens and early 20s are typically pretty self-centered. And that's not always a negative thing. I think of it more as a neutral thing. But it's just the fact of the matter, and some people decide that their self-interest is more important than others, and that's where it does become an issue. And it became an issue for Simon because he chose to be reckless above all and hurt the people in his life. If it weren't for the fact that he had upheld the relationship between him and another man and had chosen to be monogamous because he was not being non-monogamous in an ethical way, he was cheating on his partner, perhaps he would have survived, but he didn't. He passed away. He passed away before the term AIDS was even created. And it happened to be on the day that the woman told him. And Clara was at his bedside, and she heard him say that that was the day that she said that he was gonna die, and that freaked her out. So, right as his story ended, Clara's began. She had loved magic from a young age, and she was also a free spirit. So she started doing magic shows in San Francisco before meeting the guy that ended up becoming her long-term partner, who was more business-minded and took their show on the road and made it a whole production rather than just some small acts. And once again, like Simon before, I think Clara's story was done incredibly well. I was really into it. I thought the dynamic between her and her partner were incredibly interesting and compelling, and how they had love for each other, but they argued about the business side of things and the logistical side of things, and they were not perfect in any way. It really showed young people navigating through life in the way that they best knew how, and the balancing between following your passions and affording to live in the society that they live in the 80s and 90s. And I thought that dynamic was really interesting, but she couldn't ever shake off the grief from her brother, which is understandable. However, it affected her in a bigger way than it does for many people. Of course, Simon was the one she was closest to out of any of her siblings. However, she started hearing him knocking on the wall as a ghost or something like that. And throughout her life, she felt compelled to follow him. Now, Clara, her grandmother, had a trick where she would hang by her jaws. She would hold onto a rope with her teeth and suspend herself from high places, be it right off the ground to like high buildings. And she decided to adopt that trick into her act early on. It was the focal point of her whole act. And it ended up being really interesting and really symbolic, which I thought was a really interesting piece, because with Simon, I could guess his death right away. With Clara, I had assumed that it would be some sort of accident with her trick. And there was also the concept she dealt with alcohol abuse. So I had theorized, maybe she'll be blackout drunk because it's happened to her before, and she'll be reckless as she goes on stage and she'll fall and have an accident. But my expectations were subverted, and yet it was done in a symbolic way that I thought was super interesting. The cause of her death did involve a rope, but it did not involve an accident, if you catch my drift. On the night of her first big show in Vegas, as she was opening for a really big act, she decided on the day that the woman told her that she would die, that of course she must be right and she must take her destiny into her own hands. And she snuck into the suite at the top of the hotel, and unfortunately that is where she took her own life. So while absolutely devastating, of course, it was a really compelling story. And again, it's not usually my thing. I don't really like stories about San Francisco and Vegas and like that kind of thing. But it was done in an interesting enough way that it kept me interested enough. I found it more interesting things that are more my style to read, but I thought that Simon and Clara's stories were very interesting. It was Daniel and Varia's stories that I was just not interested in at all. And I think they just could have done a lot better. In these two stories, nothing really happened. At the beginning of every part, it will have the next in line's name, one of the four siblings' names, and it will have the years that it covers. So for Daniel, it was 1991 to 2006. So that's a span of 15 years. And yet, nothing really happens. We mostly cover, in those 80 or so pages, the dynamic between Daniel and his niece, Clara's daughter, that he never really got to know because the father of her daughter never really liked Clara's family and made no effort to have his daughter get close to them, even though he was an immigrant from India and his daughter didn't have any family to go to on his side either, because he snuck into the country with his uncle and his uncle passed away. So I think if it was explored even better, the dynamic between niece and uncle and family and that kind of thing, if it was explored better, it probably would have been a lot more interesting. But it just wasn't to me. I think that there were more questions that could have been posed by the characters, and could have been explored through the story, and yet it just seemed so boring to me. Clara's daughter continued to do magic after her death, and they had gotten big. The show had gotten big, and they were now millionaires living in a fantastic mansion, and Daniel can't help but be bitter because his sister lived basically in poverty until her death. So that really frustrated him to some extent, and once again, I think that that's an interesting concept to pose and like to have the characters think about, and how to see how that affects their dynamics and that kind of thing. However, I just didn't really see that much from them. It was just kind of a normal case of family who didn't know each other going like, hey, this person's all right. And I also think that it was really interesting to bring up the fact that Daniel was a military doctor post 9/11, because that didn't really come up in his part. He was put on leave for his job because his job was seeing if kids were fit enough to go to war, and he apparently wasn't letting enough kids through. And then Clara's partner and Daniel have an argument at Thanksgiving about the political state of America and America's involvement in the Middle East. However, it just didn't really get explored that much, and I really would have thought that it would have been a lot more interesting to make that more of a central point, especially since the family that we follow is Jewish and they have opinions on things that are going on in the Middle East. Those opinions may not be correct, but that would have been a really cool concept to explore too, because once again, I think Simon and Clara, they did a very good job pointing out the imperfections of the characters, but still made it a compelling story and very likable. But Daniel's part was just very boring to me, and the part involving 9/11 really seemed like more of an afterthought to me, but I didn't know why it was an afterthought, because the main topics that they were talking about, to me, just didn't feel interesting enough. I think that it would have been cool to focus more about the dynamic change in the US at the time, like they were doing in Simon's chapter and the AIDS epidemic. That would have been really interesting to explore, but it really felt like for the second half of the book, the author just kind of got lazy. I understand that this is a harsh thing to say, and I don't usually like being this harsh, but it really disappointed me because the first half is so good. I know what Chloe Benjamin is capable of because she showed off how capable she was in the first half of the book, but the second half really fell flat, and that continued in Varya's story. Daniel decided to track down and confront the woman who told them the dates of their deaths on the date of his death, and he brought a loaded weapon with him. So unfortunately, because he brought that loaded weapon and he was being violent, the police caught up with him and they had to intervene with violence. He was shot in the leg, but he was hit in an artery where there was too much blood loss and they were too far away from any sort of medical intervention, so he passed away on the date of his death, just like his two siblings. And I think that could have been cool because it was very unexpected. I just wish that the rest of the part was interesting enough. It really felt like Simon and Clara had these dynamic, interesting lives, and Daniel was just a sad man who just got put on an involuntary leave from his job and was just kind of feeling sorry for himself. And the thing that made him so compelling in the summary was just an afterthought when it actually came around to talking about him. And then Varya, I also found quite uninteresting because it was a lot of her just, again, feeling sorry for herself. I understand being upset your three siblings have passed, you don't have a lot of close family and friends, there's just not a lot of good going in your life. And I think that would have been interesting if it was explored, but I just didn't find it interesting at all. There's also the fact that I'm just not a science girly. I'm not a woman in STEM. So any of the talk about medical research, I just didn't find interesting, as important as it may be. I just thought her story was boring. She does longevity research on monkeys and she has OCD, and that's kind of all that is explored during that time. Her date of death is 2044 and the story ends in 2010, so we don't see her pass away like we do her siblings. But the thing is too, there also just really isn't a resolution to her story or the story of her siblings. You would think that it would be good to tie it all up at the end, but it just didn't feel like I got that. And the ending just kind of felt open, but not in a open, compelling way. Not like open in the way that the first season of Squid Game ends, where there's more on the horizon and we don't have all the answers to the questions, but it almost feels satisfying. It just kind of ended. I don't know. I just think that in a book where the first half was so dynamic and so compelling and so much of it hung on the words of the women that predicted their death, the ending would sort of tie that together in some way, or Varya would make some sort of interesting conclusion when it comes to the words of the woman and the fact that they were all correct, but that just doesn't happen. Varya's niece, Clara's daughter, stops doing magic and decides to become a doctor, and Varya's mom and her niece and her just kind of exist together. And again, I think that would be cool to see if there was some sort of like resolution, like look at this family, these are the ones that remain, and it's not the conventional family dynamic, especially since the mother outlived 3 of her 4 children and the niece lives with them even though their connection to her, being Clara, has died decades ago. And it could have been interesting, but it was just so abrupt and it ended so abruptly. And the second I finished it, I looked up and I was alone in my room and I stared at the wall and I just went, wow, I wish I liked that more than I did. And that's just the honest truth. I wanted to like this book so much. I mean, look at how beautiful it is. Look at how beautiful it looks. Like, I want to like it. I just don't as much as I wish I did. So I guess that's all I have to say in this video. If you liked it, make sure to like it. Comment down below if there's a book sort of along these lines that you think is better, because I think this concept is so cool. I just wish that it was done better. Like, it's frustrating. But if you like videos like this and you want to see more of my opinions, please consider subscribing. I would love it if you did. I am just having so much fun with this channel and I want to see it go on for a long time. So yeah, that's all I have to say. Without further ado, this has been Moo. I hope you have a wonderful day and I will see you in the next video. Bye bye.